Welcome back to Dry Bones, Faith and Archaeology in Conversation. Today, we're digging into the surprising story of the Neanderthals, who they were, how much like us they really were, and whether their DNA say more about the story of Adam and Eve than we've ever imagined. We will be stepping back into the Ice Age, into caves in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, where another kind of human once lived. For many of us, the Bible's first humans, Adam and Eve, come to mind when we think about human origins. But what happens when archaeology and genetics show us that there were other humans living among us? My name is Kathleen. I have a master's in anthropology with an emphasis on archaeology. I'm also a Christian. And so if you put me in a box, you would say most easily that I fit into an old earth creationist-ish views, as well as I also believe in a form of evolution. And so I just want to let you know that that is my bias up front. But what I hope to have here is a conversation where faith and archaeology can meet and where you don't have to leave your brains or your faith at the door. I want to let you know that there are going to be timestamps in the description. I like to put those in there so that you can either jump ahead or come back to rewatch certain segments. So first, we're going to spend some time in the archaeological and genetic record learning about who these Neanderthals were. And then I want to spend a little bit of time discussing if they can be reconciled to the biblical account of Adam and Eve. Or better yet, we'll ask the question, were Adam and Eve Neanderthals? Now, this is going to be a part of a bigger playlist that I'm going to put together because I want to kind of go through these different hominins that were living at the same time as Homo sapiens and just to see where they kind of fit in that biblical account. So let's start with a question. Who were the Neanderthals? So they were not these guys.
It's so easy, a caveman could do it.
What?
Oh, no,
Not cool.
I did not know you were there.
They were also not these guys. So when most people hear the word Neanderthal, they picture a caveman with this heavy brow, this club in a hand, grunting in a cave. But that image couldn't be more misleading. Now, hopefully by now, not as many people picture that, but for sure, I know a lot of people still do. Otherwise, those commercials wouldn't be so funny, right? So no, Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis, they lived from about 400 to 40,000 years ago, mostly across Europe and Western Asia. So you can see from this map where they mostly inhabited areas. They were our closest human relatives. As far as we know right now, they were our closest human relatives. So when they were first discovered, people did not know what to think about them. In fact, one early German biologist wanted to call them Homo stupidus, or stupid man, just because their skulls looked different from ours. And so why were they thought to be brutish at first? Well, let's talk about this, the first fossils that were found. Actually, the first two Neanderthal fossils that were not even recognized as Neanderthals at first. So the very first one was actually found in Belgium in 1830, but it would take decades to actually recognize it and identify it as a Neanderthal. And this was a child's skull that was found in a cave in Engis, Belgium. The second fossil, again, not recognized as a Neanderthal fossil, was found in a quarry in Gibraltar. And then finally in 1856, we have this first skeleton that's identified and named. And it was discovered in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany. The name means human from Neander Valley. and it was found in the Feldhofer cave. And this happened during a limestone quarrying operation. Some miners happened across it, and the remains consisted of this low sloping skull cap. It had these large brow ridges. There was a part of a pelvis, and there were these very thick-limbed bones. So the German workers who first found it actually thought it was this extinct bear. And so they took it to a fossil collector. Fortunately, the fossil collector knew it was something much more important than that and contacted some scientists, and he passed it along to them. So Johann Karl Fuhlrott was a scientist at the time, and he was informed, fortunately, by two quarry owners who were members of his scientific society, and they let him know about this. And he is the first one to have correctly identified them as prehistoric human remains, even though at the time, there was a lot of people fighting against him about that. And this was about 3 years before Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution. And so with that low, long skull and the thick limbs, Rudolf Virchow, who happened to be a top anthropologist at the time, he insisted that it was a modern human who just happened to be afflicted with rickets and arthritis. There were some that disagreed at the time, but most of the people, this became that leading conclusion for years. And interestingly enough, there are still some people, certain circles of people, that seem to think that all of these early hominins that weren't Homo sapiens were just people with some sort of form of issue. But we'll find out that that is not the case here. Eventually, scores of other skeletons with that same morphology found in that same time frame of the late Pleistocene made it so that they knew this was not just a random human with rickets and arthritis. So their skulls were very large, larger on average than actually people today. So that was kind of interesting, especially because there was this progressive evolution idea that thought that things should just get more and more human. So there was this gradual from the small-brained apes, and then progressively get larger until it hit modern human size. So for this one to kind of go past the modern human size, that really threw a lot of people off back then. And it's still kind of a question today about the fact that they had a bigger brain than ours, but they are no longer here. Or are they? We'll talk about that in a minute. So let's talk about Shanidar 1, because I think that Shanidar 1 brings in a very interesting aspect of Neanderthals and their culture, and a very interesting idea that we now know about them by studying this fossil. So Shanidar 1 was found in the late 1950s in an Iraqi cave named Shanidar, right? And it was dated to be about 35 to 45,000 years old. And it was also found in that cave along with 6 other adults and 3 young children. And it was on the older end of the different fossils they had found, which actually only meant that it was about 35 or 40 years old. But for the fossils they found, that was on the older end. And the skeleton shows a lot of injuries from accidents and from violence. It actually has this healed fracture of one side of his supraorbital torus, which is your brow ridge. And this is, as we'll look at in a minute, it's a lot more pronounced in Neanderthals. And that damage was enough that they think that it possibly could have caused blindness in that eye. And it possibly even could have caused brain damage. Not necessarily in the type of brain damage that would create cognitive disabilities, but in the type of brain damage that maybe a stroke would cause. And they think that maybe because when they look at the humerus, the right humerus, and if you look at this, what you're looking at here is the left and right humerus of this skeleton. And you'll see that right humerus is atrophied or kind of withered. And that also had a crippled right leg. The right arm was also amputated at the elbow joint. There was considerable wear on the teeth. Now, there's wear on the teeth of a lot of these skeletons because we do believe they use their teeth to grasp a lot and to, cut meat, hold meat or hold skins while they skinned them, these kind of things. But this one had more wear on its teeth, and they believe that it was using its mouth in place of that arm. And so that's pretty interesting. It had severe arthritis in its feet. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of Neanderthals do show a lot of head and neck trauma. And a study found that looking at the types of injuries they found in Neanderthals and looking at other types of injuries they found in other modern humans, they actually discovered that the types of injuries were very similar to the types of injuries found in like bronco riders and rodeos. So they kind of think that these Neanderthals were going out and putting themselves in great harm, but in order to kill these really large animals. And that's probably how a lot of these injuries were sustained. But kind of getting back to Shanidar. So what's really interesting about Shanidar is you look at these injuries. And let me explain too, these injuries were all healed. And so none of them led to death. They all were healed. And so this means that this Neanderthal was cared for. This Neanderthal could not have lived by itself with all these injuries. So it's really interesting to think of this family of Neanderthals and this older one that has been injured being taken care of. So this shows this level of humanity of these Neanderthals where they did take care of each other and they had this sympathy and empathy for each other. So when we look at how many of the others, so we're just going to kind of summarize the rest of the fossils that were found. There have been at least 400 Neanderthal fossils found. In fact, in Cima de los Huesos in Spain, which they call the Pit of Bones, there were 28 hominin individuals found. At first, because there was this very extreme variation of skulls, they weren't sure if this was a mixture of Erectus and Neanderthal and sapiens because they had all the kind of different traits. But they did end up classifying them as Neanderthals. And then when genetics came along, they confirmed that they were all Neanderthals. And these were dated 400,000 years ago. Just kind of a note on the dating, on the genetics of Neanderthals, Svante Pavlo very famously sequenced the first Neanderthal genome in 2010. Something interesting too about those genetics, is that in certain regions, these Neanderthals were found to have light eyes and pale skin with freckles and red hair. So it's just really interesting. That's not typically your picture and so very different than the hominins we find in Africa. So very interesting there. Not all Neanderthals did, but in certain regions they found this. And at some point we'll probably talk about, not in this video, but at some point we'll probably talk about this melanin gradient that we see around the world and where that comes from and how that developed, and which is also very interesting. So because they have found so many of the Neanderthal skeletons, it actually is the most studied hominin due to its relative completeness in the fossil records, because it's easier to know the more fossils we have, the more we can study them, the more we can make these findings about them. So let's look into how Neanderthal traits compare to Homo sapiens. So if we look at just the profile of Neanderthals to sapiens, you can see that the Neanderthals, looking at them from the side, looking at the skull from the side, you can see that it is what we term prognathic. Now, prognathic means that it just sort of comes out, like that. If you look at that mouth, it just sort of comes out more. The face comes out more. And whereas a sapiens, it's more flat. So it's sort of what they refer to as tucked up underneath that brain case. And then you look at the nose of the Neanderthals, and it's large with these wide nostrils. And they think that maybe the reasoning behind that, although it's not consistent among all hominins that are in cold regions, but they believe that these wider openings were possibly adaptations to the cold environments because that greater interior surface allows this more efficient way of warming and moisturizing the cold air. And then you look at the sapiens nose, it's narrower. And we would say that the sapiens have a more gracile face, more kind of smaller featured compared to the Neanderthals. And if you look at the brain case of the Neanderthals, you'll see that it's elongated and it just kind of goes back as if somebody's kind of pulled it back. So it's almost like somebody's kind of pulled their head like this compared to the sapiens. And it's got this occipital bun in the back. And that's just this little bump in the back that they believe possibly held these muscles. Because its head was so big, it probably had to have these very strong, big muscles that probably connected to that occipital bun. We also see that their brain measured 1,200 to 1,750 cc's, whereas the sapiens' brain measures to 1,500 cc's. So it's interesting that some of these Neanderthals had, much larger brains than we're seeing in the sapiens. And then when you look at the sapiens, so we've talked about the Neanderthals having this sort of elongated, sloping brain case, but you look at the sapiens and we use the term globular. It's like a ball. Like you might say the sapiens have more of a basketball, Neanderthals have more of a football. So we're going to look at that forehead that just sort of like sweeps back, but then on the sapiens, look how tall that is. It goes high and vertical. Then we have these brow bones that are large and prominent on the Neanderthals. And then on the sapiens, you barely even see them. They're very small. Then you have on the Neanderthals, you have these very round eye orbits. Cheekbones on these Neanderthals are, again, sort of almost like the forehead where they're just kind of like swept back. But on the sapiens, they're a lot more prominent. Neanderthals, they have these very large front teeth. And what's really neat about the teeth is just in the fossil record is thinking about the fact that, teeth do not decay like bone. So they are more readily found in that fossil record. So they're a really interesting thing to study. You can tell a lot about the teeth. You can tell what they ate. I think that's where they get a lot of DNA. Then if you look at the Neanderthal again, like look at the chin, or what is also sometimes considered what we call the mental eminence. On the Neanderthal, no chin. Sapiens, we have a chin. And there's a question about what this is used for because we are the only hominins to have a chin. So that's really interesting. But you see those Neanderthals just go straight back. And then if you look at the overall physique of Neanderthals, they have this wideness and they're short and they have these stocky limbs, these very strong limbs. But you look at the sapiens, they're tall with these very long limbs. And one of the thoughts behind that is, again, sort of this cold adapted environment. It's sort of thinking that this larger, wider body trunk reduces the amount of surface area relative to body size, which helps them retain that heat. This is actually even seen in animals too, when you look at the same type of animals in different environments. Okay, so this is future me. While I was editing, I realized that I wanted to go a little bit further into this idea of the Neanderthal's body type being adapted for cold weather. And there's two rules that fit with this that we see between the difference between the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens. And so you have Bergman's rule that talks about the size of the body. And so it is stated as saying that populations or species of larger size are found in colder environments, whereas populations or species of smaller size are found in warmer environments. And then you have Allen's rule that talks about that animals living in hotter climates generally have longer extremities, such as their limbs and stuff like that, than closely related animals living in colder climates. So I just wanted to come in and kind of put that in there to give you guys a little bit more information on that. So when you look at the rib cage of the Neanderthal, it's large and it's barrel-shaped, whereas the sapiens, it's narrow and long. The pelvis on a Neanderthal is very wide, but a sapiens, it's narrow. If you're catching the pattern here, Neanderthals thick. They've got the thick bones and they're robust. And sapiens, much more gracile. The height, so this is interesting, the height of Neanderthals, again, they were kind of short. They were about 1.5 to 1.75 meters, or 4.9 to 5.7 feet. And sapiens were about 1.76 to 1.66 meters, or 5.55 to 5.95 feet on average. The Neanderthal had these short tibias on the lower leg in relation to the femur, whereas the sapiens had these long tibias in relation to the femur. So as it turns out, these Neanderthals had larger brains than the average modern human, not smaller. And think about that for a second. The first species we labeled as brutish actually had a brain bigger than ours. Now that's an interesting thought, although brain size doesn't equate to intelligence. It does matter how the brain is organized. Let's talk about the cultural life of Neanderthals. They crafted complex stone tools. In fact, we call their stone tool culture Mousterian, and they used what we call the Levallois method. I have a hard time with that word. And so this method of making these stone tools, this visualization of the final product was necessary because it was complex and it required this hand-eye coordination. And so when you make a stone tool, it's called flintknapping. And if you've ever flint-knapped, which I honestly have only done once, I would love to do it again. I really enjoyed it. It was very relaxing. It's really interesting because when you strike it, you have to kind of know what's going to happen on the other side of that rock that you're not looking at. It requires this level of cognition, of abstract, and being able to, see cause and effect and that sort of stuff. And so part of this Levallois method as well is that you'd choose this stone or core, and then the flakes get removed. And then that tool becomes more and more specialized as these flakes get removed. So we know they cooked food. We know that they ate lots of meat and with a stable and varied diet of plants. Again, talking about the teeth before, we were able to measure these stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in their bones and calculus on their teeth to find that out. They were successful hunters. They used fire. They wore animal hides. And so some of the Neanderthal sites in Europe and Western Asia actually showed they buried their dead. So by looking at the posture of the buried remains, they were not just discarded and buried to remove them from the living areas. They were placed with care in these pits. Now, also interestingly, though, there were some Neanderthal bones found in the Krapina rock shelter in Croatia. These show signs of cut marks on the bones similar to what you would find on animals. And so the way these cut marks are found on these bones, it indicates cannibalism. And before you get all freaked out about that, cannibalism in some cultures can actually be ritualistic. It can be a way of honoring their dead. That also said, it's also in some cultures a way of showing victory over an enemy. And then, of course, in other times, it's shown as we're hungry and we need something to eat. So it's interesting to see that there are these cut marks on some of these bones that show this. They also made art and understood symbolism. They used symbolic objects. There are sites in Spain that show signs of pigment use and abstract carvings. And so this means that they could think symbolically. So that's a very human attribute. So in Cueva de los Aviones, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, they found these marine shells that were perforated with holes. And they contain these residues of red and yellow pigments. And this suggested that they were used as jewelry or decorative items, so not something they needed, but they wanted to, decorate. We know they used these pigments. They used the red and black pigments like ochre were used for body painting or to create markings on cave walls and objects. And it's really possible they could speak. This has been something that has been a question for a really long time, but it's less and less of a question than it used to be. For a long time, they couldn't find a hyoid bone. And this is why that hyoid bone, it's a bone that's right about here, and it's a bone that's not connected to any other bone. It's just connected by ligaments, and it's what helps us speak. And so we know it's in Homo sapiens, but they didn't know if it was in Neanderthals until they finally found one. And now they've found more than one. But the morphology of it is identical to the living human's hyoid. Another clue that they could speak is what they call brain laterality. And this is when the left and right sides of the brain are specialized to attend to different information, to process sensory inputs in different ways, and to control different types of motor behavior, like handedness, like right hand, left hand. In the vast majority of people, these primary language functions are located in the left hemisphere. So I didn't want to go into it in this. It's this whole idea of how to tell speech in this one. But there is an interesting video that kind of explains that. I'm going to put that in the description. It's called Why Are Some People Left-Handed? So again, kind of going back to the importance of teeth and all the things that we can find in that. So as the teeth were used as a tool to hold things like meat when they cut it, you can tell the markings, or like a skin, as they're holding the skin and they're scraping it. Sometimes they, nick their teeth. And so the markings on the teeth will indicate the handedness, because if they're right-handed, those marks are going to kind of go a certain way. And if they're left-handed, those marks are going to go a certain way. So they figured out by looking at these that most Neanderthals were right-handed, and handedness is associated with this brain laterality, and this is an evidence for ability to speak. There's also genetic proof, because this FOXP2 gene has been found in their genes, and that also strongly implicates speech ability, and that was identified in the Neanderthal genome. So Neanderthals were not just surviving. They were communicating, they were imagining, and they were living meaningful lives, far from being those brutish caricature of these old textbooks that we used to think of them as, and some people still do, But as we learn more and more about them, and I think maybe this is why I find them so fascinating, they look more and more like fully human relatives who shared not only our world, but maybe even our story. So how closely related were we? So if you look at this diagram, you can see this blurred out area where it says relationships poorly resolved. That is really interesting. So it just means that we're just not really sure. We don't have good data for that. But if you can look off to the right, coming up out of that, you'll see where up in the pink, where we have the Neanderthals, and then, kind of middle left goes up to this purple area where the modern Homo sapiens are. So somewhere in there, we have a common ancestor. So that's why we call them our cousins, and not our ancestors. What's interesting too is, are we a different species than them, or are we a subspecies? There have been people who have considered calling us Homo sapiens sapiens and calling them Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. So that would be the genus, species, and then subspecies. So genus, Homo, species, sapiens, subspecies would be either sapiens or, for them, neanderthalensis. But we just know for sure they're not our direct ancestors. So kind of looking at this to kind of compare how close we are related to them, looking at the DNA analysis. And there's different ways to look at DNA. So sometimes when people say, oh, humans and Neanderthals are this much similar, humans and chimps are this much similar, and there's differing percentages, I'm going to kind of give you hopefully a very simple but easy to understand way of looking at that. So we have what are called aligned sequences when we look at DNA. So The aligned sequences are all of those sequences that are identical or similar nucleotides. So all those things that line up. And in modern humans and Neanderthals, they are 99.4% identical. So for comparison, to recognize how close that is, and understand this is not a video about DNA or about human-chimp relationships or anything like that. That may or may not be a video for another time, but that is not this video. I just am trying to have you see what these numbers mean in similarity. But so if you look at, okay, so again, humans and Neanderthals, 99.4% identical in these aligned sequences. Humans and chimps are 98.5% identical. And then in human to human, variation is 99.9. So you can see how those are very, very close numbers. But in all honesty, there's so much DNA that they're not as close as you really think. But it does show how close Neanderthals are to humans when you compare them to how close they are to chimps. And then sort of that other way of looking at DNA is what we say is the total sequence of the DNA. So you have the aligned sequences, but then you have the total sequence. And this is where humans to Neanderthals are then 87% identical. Humans to chimps are 85.1% identical. And then, so understanding where those numbers are on that scale, human variation can be 90 to 99% identical. So you and I could only be 90% identical. And then so that helps you kind of see those numbers with an idea of that gradient that is there. The reason why I don't want to go into it is because it is a widely discussed topic with a lot of, I believe, misrepresentations surrounding these different ways of looking at the DNA. So I did put a few different links in the description if you want to delve a little deeper into that. Again, I may or may not do a video on it at some point, but I know that it's a very interesting topic for a lot of people. So I did want to go ahead and put a few different, I've got some videos from creationist, young earth creationist, and then I've also got some videos in there from, I call them evolutionist. I didn't realize that was a derogatory term until the other day somebody pointed that out to me, because I had called myself an evolutionist. But people who believe in evolution or, agree with evolution, however you want to put that. But so I tried to put a variety of links in the description so you can look at different viewpoints on that. And then so here's where it gets even more interesting, and this will probably come up a lot, is that our ancestors and Neanderthal ancestors didn't just meet, they interbred. Every person of non-African descent today carries about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's going to come up in a little bit. But by strict biological definitions, going back to this idea of are we the same species or are we subspecies, it's hard to say that we were completely different species because obviously they could have viable, fertile offspring. So when you look at the biological species definition that most of us grew up understanding, that would make us the same species. The biological species definition says group of populations of organisms that can interbreed in nature to produce viable, fertile offspring and are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Another definition allows for that space to still be separate species, and that is called the evolutionary species concept. And this is where a single lineage of ancestor-descendant populations that maintains its identity from other such lineages and possesses its own evolutionary tendencies and historical fate. This focuses on the historical continuity of a lineage rather than specific biological traits like interbreeding. It also highlights something bigger. Classification is messy. There are some scientists called lumpers, and there are some scientists called splitters. And lumpers will group similar fossils together, are more apt to group similar fossils together. Splitters are more apt to separate more into new species. So these are just human attempts to organize a continuum that nature does not always keep so tidy, but we like our boxes. And that's how sometimes that can get confusing, is when we are trying so hard to put them in a box. But keep in mind, defining a fossil as a Homo sapien or some other hominin, it's not just about a single trait. It's about a combination of traits. That's why even though we may see modern humans with one or two Neanderthal traits, like a large brow like this, that doesn't make them Neanderthal. It's a combination of traits that they find in these fossils that define a species or define the species. And keep in mind, too, fossil record is biased. We see more from certain areas because of environmental conditions. And there are going to be some areas where we're never going to see any. It doesn't mean nobody ever lived there. It means that those conditions were not conducive for creating a fossil. So our materials to study will always be incomplete. But as methods and technology get better, hopefully we will have a more complete picture. But that's also to understand that these are scientific theories. They're not laws. And so I've seen a lot of discussion from young Earth creationists about whether Neanderthals were human or not. And I just want them to understand that they are recognized as human. The fact that they have Homo as part of, that they come under the genus Homo, says they are human. They are in that human category because Homo means human. It's just a matter of species, different subspecies, but they still fall under the same genus. Let's talk about, could Neanderthals fit into the biblical story? So we're going to take this scientific story and we're going to bring it into a theological conversation. The Neanderthals and sapiens coexisted for at least 10,000 years. And honestly, by some of the things that I researched, it was way longer than that. So there's a good chance it was much longer than that. So if Neanderthals and modern humans coexisted and even interbred, what does this mean for the biblical account of Adam and Eve? Could Adam and Eve, let's get back to that question from the very beginning, could Adam and Eve themselves be Neanderthals and not Homo sapiens? As I don't know about you, but I think most of us have assumed that they were. There are some Christian scholars that propose that Adam and Eve were a historical pair chosen by God from among a larger human population. So that's just one viewpoint. And so that's the idea behind what we call the genealogical Adam and Eve model. And so Adam and Eve were made as a special creation. That was the God creating them, is that God created them as a special creation. But then at some point, their offspring, perhaps Cain's family, check out my other video if you want to hear about that. But perhaps Cain's family interbred with, these previously made hominins. And if you want to kind of say, well, the Bible doesn't talk about these other hominins being made, there is not a list of all the animals and all the creations that God made in the Bible. There just isn't. So we don't know if that just was left out. I mean, God doesn't say, he classifies each level of what he's creating, as in, the ones that, were on land, the ones were in the sea, this type, the ones that are in the air. The Bible doesn't say God made a penguin, then God made an elephant, then God made a raccoon. He doesn't do that. So it is possible that he made these other hominins, and then Adam and Eve went out, or Cain went out and populated with them, and then maybe eventually, further Adam and Eve descendants did. And then eventually, just like what we sort of see with Neanderthals, when I said that a percentage of Neanderthals, this 1 to 2% of all non-Africans today have a little bit of Neanderthal DNA in them, that is this idea that it lends itself to the idea that Neanderthals kind of got absorbed into Homo sapiens. So they really never went extinct at all. They just sort of interbred with us enough, and we outnumbered them, that eventually all of them just sort of got absorbed genetically into Homo sapiens. And so the same idea, because we do know that in our DNA, we have what we call ghost ancestors. So these ghost ancestors are ones that haven't been discovered yet. And we know Denisovans also were interbred. And so we know that there is this level of interbreeding that took place. If you can picture the idea that Adam and Eve, God makes them as a special creation, they go out, Cain goes out, and then eventually, Adam and Eve's, Seth's ancestors go out, and they end up kind of interbreeding enough with all these other hominins out there. And I know there's going to be the talk about Nephilim in that discussion, but I'm not going to discuss that right now. I'm just going to talk about this idea that this interbreeding happened so much that all these hominins either eventually just went extinct for other reasons, or they all got absorbed into the Homo sapiens through this interbreeding, so that by the time of Jesus, and now us, all humans alive would have been genetically linked to Adam and Eve. So then there is no conflict with the Bible that talks about in Acts 17:26, from one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. So this model actually does fit beautifully with both the genetic record and Scripture's claim of that. And in 1 Corinthians 15:22, it says, "For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive." So this hypothesis, I think, fits in very well with the idea that these early hominins interbred enough with Adam and Eve's descendants that they ended up becoming absorbed into it. There are others that take a more symbolic approach. They see Adam and Eve as a story about what it means to be human, our calling, our moral awakening, our fall, and our need for redemption. In that sense, the story doesn't exclude Neanderthals or any other ancient humans. It just includes them in that larger tapestry of creation. So here's a question to sit with. If Neanderthals shared our intelligence, our emotion, our capacity for relationship, is it possible that they also shared in the divine image? And this is where faith and science often meet and sometimes collide. Some Christians worry that if Genesis isn't taken literally, if the world isn't exactly 6,000 years old, then everything else, even the resurrection of Christ, must crumble. But I believe that's a false connection. I believe honesty and transparency about science doesn't weaken faith. It strengthens it. I know it has mine. It has been amazing to look into these different ways that God possibly made the earth or made humans or all these different things that he did. It's just, and as I've mentioned before, the wonder of creation, the wonder of a baby developing in the womb, the wonder of a seed dying and becoming a flower, just the wonder of everything that you can just look outside, and the beauty of a sunset. Well, I think the sunset's actually, let me kind of stick with that one for a second. If we go in and we say, oh, well, a sunset is because, I have no idea how sunsets are created. I'm just saying, if we say, oh, well, the sunset gets created because the prism of the clouds and the bend of the earth and the this and the that, and we study that and we figure out that's how those colors get on there. Does that make it any less amazing? Does that make it any less beautiful? Does that make it any less created? Just sit with that for a little bit. when we ignore or twist what science says, forcing data to fit our theology, or continue to push old hypotheses that are no longer, and in some cases never were, a part of current understanding, trust me, this only drives people away. I have talked to many of them, and it typically will drive them away from God more than it's going to drive them away from science. The real miracle isn't the speed of creation. It's that there is a creation, that the universe exists at all, that life arose, and that consciousness emerged to ask questions about its creator. By tying salvation to the age of the earth, we risk missing the bigger picture, the wonder that the same God who shaped galaxies also shaped us, and he breathed into us the breath of life. I want you to look at this video too, and I'll put it again in the description. Clint's Reptiles. I really like this guy. I watch a lot of his videos. Well, a lot of his videos are on reptiles. I don't really watch those, but I watch a lot. He's a Christian. He's also an evolutionary biologist, and he used to be an atheist. And I believe he speaks to this concept pretty well, and in particularly this video that I'm going to put in the description, but you can also check out many of his others. Also, Hugh Ross, who's an astrophysicist and a founder of Reasons to Believe. Again, somebody who was an atheist, and it was science. It was by discovering the wonder of how things were created that brought him to. So he's got a great story too. So listen to his story as well. He's also somebody who addresses this issue with a lot of grace. So maybe it's time to stop seeing Genesis as a line we have to defend and start seeing it as a window. One that lets us glimpse the mystery of who we are and who made us. Now, sorry, I kind of went off on a little tangent there. I didn't exactly plan that when I did this, but it as I was doing research and looking at this and looking at that, I was just, it's just wonder. It's just wonder. Anyway, and I hope you find it too. So just my own personal take, right? So do I think Adam and Eve were Neanderthals? Honestly, I think it's likely that they were an even more archaic human further back in time. And remember that area on that chart where it was all kind of blurred out, and I said we don't know where our common ancestor was. It's also termed as the muddle in the middle. And I'm going to discuss that more in the next videos in this playlist. But I just am curious if maybe it's somewhere in that muddle in the middle, there is that ancestor that fits more time-wise into Adam and Eve. And genetic-wise, maybe genetic-wise is probably a better way to put that. Researching for my last video on Cain and his wife in the land of Nod is really what got me interested in delving deeper into this connection between the first humans in the Bible and the first humans we see, in the fossil record. If that sounds interesting to you, you can check out that video here. Thanks for joining me today. Next time, we'll keep following these ancient trails, asking how archaeology and faith can illuminate one another. Until then, I'm Kathleen. This is Dry Bones, and God bless you.
Dry bones, easy go, cry them, dry bones.